So thank you so much to Francesco for giving us an introduction and a really whirlwind overview of what ICARRD is, its history, and some of these new findings. And also thank you so much to Annie and the organisers for inviting me to be here and making it possible for me to be here. I will try to be very quick. My role is really to build on, I think, what basically everyone here today has spoken about in different ways, and to offer some questions, some provocations for you all to think about. So instead of you guys asking us questions in this session, I'm going to be asking you some questions to think about, and then we'll do a little interactive exercise where you can answer my questions for me. Thank you. Yes, so what can Scotland offer and what can Scotland learn at ICARRD? So in June, I was a co-organiser along with some friends and colleagues, including my colleague here, Alex, who's speaking tomorrow, of the inaugural UK Agrarian Reform Colloquium. And it was envisaged as a way to bring people together who are researching land reform and agrarian-related issues across the UK, particularly those who are focusing on the UK. And in the end, we had around 30 people, including some of those here at this conference, coming from each of the devolved nations of the UK, as well as the Republic of Ireland. In my doctoral research, I have focused on the relationship between property and food systems. And in particular, I've noticed that there's a tendency in work that looks at the nexus of those two issues to centre, as Francesco was just saying, the Global South. Questions of property, it's often assumed, are not really relevant in the North. They're settled, if only implicitly. There's no more interesting questions to ask here. Even amongst critical researchers, this reflects an implicit developmental narrative or teleology of property. In the past, maybe, or in less developed nations, property might be complex, involving overlapping plural rights regimes, informality, the incomplete dominance of the ownership model of private ownership. Over time, however, with sufficient development, property evolves and its natural endpoint is reached, which is private ownership. This assumption naturalizes a very particular form of property and leaves unasked the very many important questions that can and must be asked about property in the countries of the North, like Scotland, and like you all are actually asking here. So as far as I understand, that teleology of property has also implicitly informed the UK's historical involvement in events like ICARRD, which, if they've happened at all, have centred on its role in terms of foreign aid and development. But for those of us who organised the colloquium earlier this year, this framing is a mistake. So it's a mistake for two reasons. First, I think because it misses an important opportunity for the UK and for Scotland in particular to share its own experiences of land reform. Scottish land reforms of the 21st century may not be perfect, as some people in this room forcefully argue, but they are an important contribution to conversations about land and agrarian reform on a global stage. Why do I think that? Scottish land reforms demonstrate that actually property relations are not settled in the North, just as they are not settled in the South. They demonstrate that property is always in the making, and that not only does there lie something beyond the horizon of private ownership, but that it can actually be both desirable and possible to travel there. In terms of that question of possibility, as the research of my PhD supervisor, Christine Shields, who's speaking tomorrow, and many others demonstrates, and as also has been mentioned today, Scottish land reforms are significant because of how they've dealt with the issue of property ownership and human rights. In particular, they have demonstrated that actually this so-called right to property is not absolute and can be limited when it is in the public interest to do so. This is particularly important in a broader global climate of rising ownership absolutism, with governments, including my home government in Aotearoa, New Zealand, doubling down on a highly restrictive vision of this right to property that prioritises the interests of existing private landowners above all else. But it's not only a mistake for the Scottish Government not to engage with ICARRD because of the lessons and experiences it has to share with others, but also because of what it stands to learn from the experiences of other countries and other movements. For example, It might learn from Brazil's and other countries' approach to property, which incorporates a constitutional recognition that property serves a social function, not just an individual one. I think such an approach chimes quite nicely with the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement, and might give inspiration for how that instrument might be strengthened. Secondly, it might learn about the need to think about land reform in terms of agrarian reform. Dr. Elise Bach's and others' research has demonstrated that there has so far been very little overlap between agricultural and land reform policy in Scotland. Yet in the context of a changing climate with surging levels of food insecurity, transforming food systems towards ones that both help to mitigate and are resilient to climate change and have the capacity to equitably feed people well, this is an increasingly urgent task. And my research and that of others has shown that this is impossible without intending two systems of land and property. It might also deepen Scotland's engagement with land redistribution, as we've talked about today, and in particular, redistribution through non-market instruments. Scotland's land reforms may have redistributive intentions, but that has not necessarily been their effect, as we've heard today multiple times. As Andy Whiteman's research has demonstrated, even though 2.8% of Scottish land is now owned by communities, at the other end of the spectrum, land is actually becoming more concentrated. I won't go into that, we've heard it already today. This is not to say that the increasing area of land owned by communities is not significant, because it very much is, but rather to insist that there is more that could be done to actively encourage and enable redistribution, and that other countries, especially those of the South, have important lessons to teach in this regard. Finally, Scotland might learn more about what it looks like to go beyond redistribution. At the recent Land, Life and Society conference held in Cape Town in South Africa, delegates, including representatives from Indonesia, Colombia, Zimbabwe, Brazil, and almost 50 other countries, and I believe also Francesco, they developed a declaration of priorities to take to ICARRD+20. And the declaration crucially included that land distribution cannot focus narrowly on individual private property or it will fail. A wider range of property relations must be acknowledged. In Scotland, this idea already exists through community-oriented land reforms that have been implemented over the past 2 decades. But I would also argue, or at least encourage people to consider, that these reforms don't necessarily challenge private ownership. There may be multiple owners, but they are channeled through an individual legal entity. And in terms of the rights that entity receives, these are pretty similar to the rights that many other owners might hold. As a provocation, as legal geographer Carol Rose once wrote, the limited commons is a recognizable version of a bounded and exclusive property, even if the boundaries encompass an entire community rather than a single individual. They are commons on the inside, but private property on the outside. So, on that note, my questions for you today are these. What is special about Scotland's land reforms, which could support other countries and movements looking to challenge property in their countries? Because I think it is special. Does Scotland need agrarian reform as well as just land reform? And what might that look like? How could Scottish land reform better enable redistribution and limit land concentration? Do non-market-based measures have a role to play here? And what might it look like for Scottish land reform to go beyond redistribution? How could that build on Scotland's unique geography, history, culture, anything else? I think Scotland is uniquely positioned amongst countries of the global north to play an important role in the growing global movement of states and civil society for land and agrarian reform and transformation. And I think ICARRD+20 represents a unique opportunity for Scotland to be a part of leading the world when it comes to remaking rural and urban places in ways that center justice, equity, sustainability, and human flourishing. Hopefully this conference and this session provides you all with an opportunity to consider how it might best take advantage of that opportunity. So that's the end of my talk, and then we'll move on to something else. So these are the questions, and my suggestion is I've created a little mirror board, which I'll bring up on here. My suggestion is that you just talk to people around you instead of trying to move around into different groups.